The premise to John Carter sounds a bit strange at first. A guy goes to Mars, rescues a princess, falls in love with her, and then saves her kingdom. Yet aside from the Mars aspect, it actually follows a fairly classic archetype. A stranger in a strange land, whose interests are purely selfish, gets involved with someone different from himself, and through that person becomes devoted to a larger cause. Some modern examples of this archetype include Avatar, Mad Max Fury Road, and even WALL-E to some extent. But if these 4 movies are all telling different versions of the same story, how come only 3 of them are good? To answer that, let's look at the way these 3 films start. Despite their differences, they all follow a similar pattern. Establish a point of view character, show the current situation that character is in, and hint that a larger story is looming just over the horizon. The main benefit of this approach is that we, the audience, can immediately interpret the information we're given through the eyes of our protagonist. This makes the story easier to understand, which is particularly helpful in the sci-fi fantasy genre where it's easy to get lost, and makes what we're watching more relatable, since we're always gauging what we learn against the impact it has on our hero. But what if a movie did the complete opposite, starting with the larger story, then working backwards to a point of view character? In that case, not only would it be harder to figure out what's happening, it would be harder to figure out why what's happening matters, which isn't to say that it couldn't work. It certainly did with Star Wars, but it's worth noting that that film goes out of its way to address these 2 issues, beginning with clearly defined bad guys who overpower clearly defined good guys, which puts us on the side of the disadvantaged. John Carter does the opposite of this, beginning by throwing us into the middle of a chaotic firefight where neither good guys nor bad guys are clearly defined, and where without this voiceover,
Zodanga, the Predator City,
we likely would have assumed these were the good guys since they're the ones at a disadvantage. This battle that's both hard to follow and hard to care about is then interrupted by bald people who can fly, so that another vaguely defined bad guy can team up with our first vaguely defined bad guy to concoct an evil plan that so far only matters to them. The story then jumps to our hero during a scene that has no discernible connection to the battle we just saw, and that's over almost as soon as it starts. Then we jump to our hero's nephew, whose only purpose as far as I can tell is to give away the ending. Then at long last we meet our protagonist in the place where the story should have started, but instead of taking its time, the film bull rushes through 4 separate storylines of which only 2 matter: John the Gold Miner, John the AWOL Soldier, John the Grieving Widow, and John the Thurn Killer. What I find particularly baffling about this terrible introduction is that it was written and directed by Andrew Stanton, who also wrote and directed WALL-E, which is one of my favorite movies. Equally strange is that one of Stanton's co-writers is Michael Chabon, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. These guys aren't amateurs, yet their film gets off to one of the worst starts I've ever seen. So with the first act over, the story transitions to Mars, where John takes his first step and learns he can jump really high. While this isn't necessarily terrible, it's not terribly engaging either. Let's compare that scene to this one in Avatar, where Jake first learns to use his Na'vi counterpart. In both sequences, the characters are learning a new ability, and they start to enjoy themselves along the way. However, in Avatar, thanks to its much more coherent beginning, we knew Jake was going to be doing this. We also know how he's doing this, and we have a good sense of where this will lead. Jake's going to use his avatar to venture out into Pandora. Because we know where we are, where we were, and where we might be going, the story has a great sense of progression. John Carter doesn't. This ability comes out of nowhere. It's never explained, at least not in a satisfactory way.
Must be the density of your bones.
And since the story had no continuity up to this point, it gives us no reasonable expectation for what this ability might lead to. And though John certainly does go on to jump a lot for the rest of the movie, I never found it very exciting when he did. Compare that scene to this one in WALL-E, where WALL-E escapes a near-death situation
20 seconds to self-destruct.
and then flies around in space with Eve. This scene works so well because we understand the problem. WALL-E's stuck in a pod that's about to explode, but we don't yet know the solution. He's gonna grab this fire extinguisher. While that's exciting by itself, it also leads to 2 important changes. Prior to this scene, Eve was trying to get rid of WALL-E. And up until now, WALL-E couldn't fly. Through circumstance and ingenuity, WALL-E not only escapes from danger, he gives himself an ability he didn't previously have, and that ability helps him achieve what he's wanted since the start of the story, to be close to Eve. John Carter, which again was made by the same guy who wrote and directed WALL-E, gets this backwards. Instead of being confronted with problems he then has to solve, John's jumping ability preemptively gives him the solution to problems he hasn't even faced yet. We the audience never have to wonder how John's going to escape from danger or how he's going to access something high above him. We already know he's going to use this magical ability he did nothing to deserve and that gives him a huge advantage over every other character. This scene where he rescues Princess Deja is a prime example. Though visually exciting, I still found this boring because it's so predictable. What if John couldn't jump a mile in the air? Then how would he save Deja? I don't know, which means I'd want to keep watching to find out. But thanks to John's jumping ability, I knew the answer before the movie even showed me. Now I will admit the addition of Deja improves the film. She provides a crucial plotline and gives the story a better sense of progression, but while the pacing and overall cohesiveness of the story improves at this point, the film continues to spend time on things that don't matter. For instance, the Tharks aren't supposed to know who their children are, but Tars Tarkas, leader of the Tharks, knows he's the father of Sola. This forbidden knowledge comes into play when Sola follows John and Deja into the Thark temple.
No, you cannot enter here! It is forbidden!
A rule infraction that earns her a death sentence because she's been punished so many times before there's nowhere left on her body to leave these burn marks.
There's no room for another mark, Sola.
We got two problems here. First, the rules that govern Thark culture are poorly explained.
It is forbidden!
Avatar does a much better job explaining Na'vi culture. Consider this scene where Jake shows up flying on Taruk. Shown out of context, this doesn't make much sense. But if you watch the movie from the beginning, you understand why Jake is being treated with such reverence here. In an earlier scene, Jake and Neytiri are attacked by Taruk. And afterwards, Neytiri explains to Jake the significance of Taruk.
It is Taruk, last shadow.
Yeah, right. It's the last one you ever see.
And that one of her ancestors was Taruk Makto,
Rider of last shadow.
who united all the Na'vi clans, which is exactly what Jake goes on to do. James Cameron knew that in order for an audience to care about a completely made-up culture, we needed to understand it as well as the characters, and we needed to do so well in advance. John Carter again gets this backwards. We don't learn it's forbidden for John, Deja, and Sola to go in the Thark Temple until after they've gone in the Thark Temple. And this Thark faux pas about Sola being Tars Tarkas' daughter
She's your daughter, isn't she?
is still being explained after Sola's been sentenced to
A
death.
Thark has no parent but the Horde.
That's just bad writing. You can't expect an audience to care about something that's neither self-explanatory nor explained ahead of time, something Andrew Stanton should have known. He's quoted as saying, "Good storytelling never gives you 4, it gives you 2 + 2, which is the opposite of what this Thark subplot does." Now I should point out that even if this was well written, I still doubt we'd care because of the other major problem with this scene, which is that the Tharks don't really matter. That by itself isn't necessarily a problem. A sequence in Mad Max Fury Road handles a similar scenario. Max and Furiosa roll through a shortcut controlled by a dirt bike gang, and similar to the Tharks, this dirt bike gang doesn't matter that much. However, all we learn about these bikers is that they've made a deal with Furiosa.
3,000 gallons of gasoline, just like you asked.
They're mad about the terms of that deal.
You said a few vehicles in pursuit. Maybe. We count 3 war parties.
And they react violently when the deal falls through. That's it. That's all we learn, and that's fine. Imagine having to suffer through some drawn-out subplot about how these bikers raise their kids. We'd be thinking, why are you wasting our time with this? Get back to the story, which is exactly how I felt whenever John Carter lingered on the Tharks. Whereas Mad Max is a wonderfully minimalist film, staying with what matters while steadfastly ignoring what doesn't, John Carter often does the reverse, covering what doesn't matter at the expense of what does. The Tharks have little to do with John getting back to Earth, John and Deja's budding romance, or the war between Helium and Zedonga. These storylines do matter, and they're all underdeveloped. This war is given so little attention that I'm not even sure what they're fighting over. Territory? Resources? Environmental policies? Does Zedonga not know that they're destroying Mars, or do they not care? The movie clearly wants us to root against Zedonga and for Helium, but aside from this 10 seconds of voiceover in the very beginning,
Zodanga, the Predator City. Moving, devouring.
it doesn't give us much of a reason to. It never shows us what life is like for the average Helium resident. In Avatar, we know what life is like for the Na'vi. Their war with the humans develops before our eyes for reasons we can clearly understand, and as a result, we'd root for them even if Jake and Neytiri were removed from the film. Likewise, in Mad Max, we'd want Joe's wives to be free regardless of Max and Furiosa, just as we'd want the people who live around the Citadel to rise above their oppressors. Get rid of John, Deja, and this 10 seconds of voiceover,
Only the great city of Helium dared resist.
And we'd have no reason to care who wins the Helium-Zedonga conflict. John Carter is a fantasy. All we know about this make-believe war is what the movie tells us, and the movie barely tells us anything. Andrew Stanton still isn't giving us enough information, which he should have known was going to screw up his story. Not only did he say this, he's also quoted as saying, "Don't give the audience the answer, give the audience the pieces and compel them to conclude the answer." Once again, he's correct, and once again, he doesn't take his own advice. Good stories provide just enough information for the audience to try and figure out what's going to happen. For instance, in Avatar, we wonder if Jake will betray the Na'vi. How will the Na'vi fight back against the more powerful humans? How will Jake and Neytiri make it as a couple if they're different species and Jake is just a guy in a machine? In Mad Max, we wonder if Max and Furiosa can trust each other, if Nux will realize he's living a lie, and if the green place Furiosa wants to get to is even real. In WALL-E, we wonder why is WALL-E the only functioning robot on Earth? What is Eve looking for? What's going to happen when she finds it? And why doesn't Otto want the Axiom to return home?
Out there is our home! Home, Otto! And it's in trouble.
These are all good questions because they're neither easy nor impossible to answer. In John Carter, we get questions like, how is John going to get this Thurn medallion back from Tars Tarkas? The answer is Tars gives it to him because he wants John to take Sola away after she's been sentenced to death for breaking too many Thark rules. This is a lousy answer. Thark rules are poorly explained. On top of that, the Tharks don't matter, and on top of that, who wants to watch the hero of a story simply be given the thing he's after? Next, we have the question of how will John figure out how to use the medallion, and the answer is he takes it to the Gates of Is.
The Gates of Is.
A place we the audience don't learn about until after it's revealed as the place John needs to take the medallion. This question is literally impossible. Andrew Stanton keeps getting his own description of good storytelling backwards. Instead of giving us the pieces and compelling us to conclude the answer, he just gives us the answer. As for John and Deja's relationship, unlike Jake and Neytiri, or Max and Furiosa, or Wally and Eve, there are no significant obstacles between them, so we never have to wonder if and how they'll overcome them. Deja may technically be an alien, but she looks like a supermodel. Deja tries to deceive John twice and bring him to Helium, but it doesn't lead to a lack of trust between them because John doesn't care. John tells Deja he wants to get back to his cave of gold.
I've got a cave of gold of my own.
But he'll be even richer if he stays on Mars. John tells Deja he doesn't want to get involved in a war he has no part in.
No good will come out of me fighting your war.
But his words are completely contradicted by his actions. And as for this mysterious woman who winds up being John's wife, she died before the story even started. If she was still alive, we'd have a real obstacle on our hands, but she's not, so we don't. Finally, we have the war between Helium and Zedonga, the outcome of which never feels in doubt. Matai Chang captures John, but who cares? John is captured 7 times in this movie, and he gets away every time. John has to defeat these abominable polar bears and kill Tal Hargis, but who cares? John is a super strong killing machine with magical jumping ability. John has to convince the Tharks to fight for Helium, something they earlier claimed they wouldn't do.
Let red men kill red men until only Tharks remain.
But who cares? Before he can even deliver this knockoff Avatar speech, the Tharks inexplicably pledge him their full support.
You applied your metal to mine!
And this is after John killed like 50 Tharks the day before. As for the battle itself, even though Helium is caught off guard, and even though Zedonga is being helped by the godlike Therns who wield infinite power and can vaporize anyone they want, who cares? This thing is over in 5 minutes to the surprise of no one. Whenever John Carter needed to be exciting, it was boring. When it needed to be surprising, it was predictable. When it needed to be clear, it was confusing. And when it needed to move on, it meandered. As for how the story could have been better, getting rid of this terrible introduction and going right to John as a gold miner would be a good start. Skipping the Tharks and going right to John saving Deja would move things along. Having Deja bring John to Helium would allow him, and us, to meet some people from Helium and see the terrible toll the war is taking on them. And the obstacle between John and Deja should have been the Thurn medallion. She could take it to use as a weapon and refuse to give it back. One thing I couldn't figure out, however, was the Therns. Their master plan of giving Sabthon their weapon and then marrying him to Deja only so he can turn around and kill her makes no sense. The Therns could kill Deja themselves. They could kill everyone themselves. They're basically gods. So yeah, I couldn't figure out what to do there, and apparently neither could Andrew Stanton. Though John Carter was originally planned as a trilogy, after its disappointing release, Disney canceled 2 planned sequels and let the rights revert back to the estate of Edgar Rice Burroughs. Whether or not that was a smart decision is actually debatable. Though John Carter was labeled as a box office bomb, in the long run it did earn a profit, which was no easy feat considering it had to earn $350 million just to break even, and it had to do so with virtually no built-in audience. The sequels, however, had they been made, wouldn't have had that problem since now everybody knows about John Carter, and though I personally didn't like the movie, Andrew Stanton is still brilliant, his resume is still stunning, and he was fully committed to seeing this thing through. Who knows, John Carter Part 2 might have blown us all away. But it wasn't meant to be. Anyway, that's my take on how John Carter got storytelling backwards.